C.C. Rudge and the McKees were early promoters. Barbara Fey, Bob's wife, is a descendant of the McKees from her mother. Bob's wife is a descendant of the McKees from her mother Margaret. The early picnics were at the McKee Grove, south of Palmyra. They included a racetrack for horses and a ball field south of the elevator on the west side of the road. And the Cameron track and amphitheater was also east of the former lumber yard, now used by the co-op. People came by train to attend, and political speakers were included, such as the governor or William Jennings Bryan. The old merry-go-rounds were steam or horse-drawn, and one was even pushed by the owner. There were no annual picnics for several years during World War I. Carnivals at the park were popular in the 1940s. There have been parades for many years and dances. Winifred Lanning Dowding wrote a history of the Old Settlers Picnic in 1987, its centennial year. You may borrow it and other information at the Otoe County Museum in Syracuse. Part of the 1933 Old Settlers Picnic was the dedication of the Oregon Trail marker a half-mile south of Palmyra on the Douglas Road. This commemorates the second night stop on the Western Trail from Nebraska City to Fort Kearny to Denver. The stones were gathered from the foundation of the Oakley store in use in 1867, now the Springman Farm, southeast of Palmyra. You can see the Oregon Trail tracks south and east of this marker, and it is believed that the camp was a half a mile west of this marker. Chris Sorensen and his cousins owned the blacksmith shop from 1914 to 1948. Later, Merle Sorensen owned and operated the machine shop, and his son Jim also worked there. It has been in the Sorensen family over 80 years. You could buy gasoline here, at the Ford Garage, the Co-op, the Roy Thompson Home, and at Bill Guy's. There was a cafe briefly north of here in the 1950s. A creamery was located south of Sorensen's and was run by Chet and Beatrice Lamb Kellogg, and later Harley Cleach. Farmers brought eggs, milk, and cream to sell to Fairmont Company. Beatrice taught the primary room for many years. The next little building that would not be there anymore, a small ice house, was here. People needed big blocks of ice for their ice boxes before they had electric refrigerators. Farmers got electricity about 1940. The ice boxes were made of wood and metal. Lana's Beauty Shop was formerly a doll museum, and Roy Lanning's and Royal's standard filling station before that. In the early days, the Opera House was on this corner and later burned in 1913. To the east is the Fire Barn, and Bill Smith's and formerly L.D. McKay's Pioneer Seed Corn and Insurance Building, and formerly the L.G. Nash Implement Store, which was the first Catholic church building moved and remodeled. Pumps had a filling station on the corner east in the 40s and 50s, so the businesses extended a block east of Main Street. Bill Weatherhogg's ancestors homesteaded south of Palmyra. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres of free land if people would live on and improve their claim 5 years. People came from New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Indiana. Thomas Weatherhogg came to Nebraska in 1865. Charles Weatherhogg had orchards with hundreds of bushels of fruit and Poland China hogs. Weatherhogg's store was run by 3 generations, George, Albert, and Bill. Besides groceries, they sold fabric, bulk peanuts, had vinegar in a barrel, and had living quarters on the east end. There was an open box elevator to the basement. This store was a popular place for the women to sit and visit when they came to town Saturday nights. The kids would write graffiti on the north side of the building, such as Gera loves Johnny. And today it is the Palmyra Consignment Auction Building. Palmyra Items, 1885 to 1947, was the local weekly newspaper. In 1919, it cost 3 cents. C.A. Sweet Jr., 1883 to 1959, was the youngest editor in the United States, 1902 to 1916, when he was ages 19 to 33. Letters from Palmyra men in World War I were printed in the Items to Charlie. You can see microfilm of the Palmyra items at the State Historical Society in Lincoln. Later, Mr. Sweet was assistant bank cashier and was manager and cashier. After 1948, he owned and operated the Ford Motor Company. Bill Weatherhogg's Uncle Bill worked at the paper. Beautiful language was used in these old papers. The C.E. Witherows ran the paper with the help of their daughter Mary Conklin most of its last 25 years. She taught at Palmyra High School and sponsored the school paper, the High Times, for many years. This building now belongs to Clinton Nash. Ransford's Meat Market and Harry Hall's Cream Station were also in this area. Now Frank Wyman and Barbara Brown had a big barber shop, and Irene Gray Dowding had a beauty shop in the same building in 1935. Wyman's left in 1942 to barber at the Lincoln Air Base during World War II. Bud Erlin was the barber and had a liquor store in the 1950s and 60s, and Rod Hespin was across the street briefly. Most recently, the building was a laundromat owned by Jimmy Kohler. The first telephone office was located here. Where Bill's store is now used to be an open area with a big wooden screen on the east and boards on concrete blocks for seats for the free shows Wednesdays and Saturday nights. The businessman paid a traveling projector owner who went to several small towns around for weekly free shows at Eagle and Unadilla also, for example. In the early 1940s, the free shows were at the north end of the west side of the street. The shows stopped when people got TVs in the early 1950s. The nights of the free shows were called open nights, and the stores were busy. Bill built the new grocery store in 1975. Where the Palmyra peddler, Leslie Smith, now stores his inventory, used to be Dick White's Grocery and Wilhelm's Red Bird Grocery, and formerly belonged to Fred Haley's. The Oddfellows Hall was above the store and had an outside entrance for a time. Before 1914, it was J.R. McKees Grocery. Becky Steinoff restored the 1890s hotel for her boutique, and it is now an antique store and home. In the 1940s and 50s, here with a soda fountain, and there were living quarters above. It was also the bus stop. Later, it was run by Denver McPherson. It sat empty for a time until Becky's renovation. In the distant past, the cars parked in the middle of the street. Before that, there were boardwalks 4 feet above ground that preceded sidewalks. The Masonic Lodge Hall occupies the location of Mr. Waite's Hardware, and later a hardware store owned by Chris and Marie Olson. Noel Goldens owned it in 1961 when it burned, plus 2 adjoining buildings. Next door to the south of the Masonic Lodge Hall, was above Tom Bell's Memorial Hall. The first floor of the Tom Bell building was a men's clothing store. In the 1930s, Louis Krantz had a grocery in this building and went to farms to butcher and sold some of the meat. In 1945, the government standards required that meat to be sold had to come from a packing plant, so that practice ended. Tom Bell brought 100 people from England to Palmyra in 1867. He left England due to his health. It took 21 days' travel on the ocean. And south, chemicals for lights were sold in the next building, and next Henry Mccart's candy store, south of Tuff or Clyde Waite's, was a popular place, and today they're selling fireworks from the home of Tuff Waite. Looking at the south front of the hotel, and as you would walk down the sidewalk east, half a block east of the drugstore, there was a small jail that stood unused as late as the 1940s or 50s. It originally was a public restroom and shelter built by Mayor Dick Nash in 1930. 1 block east of Becky's, or the drugstore, was a 2-story hotel, the Palmyra House. It was the home of the Emil Lemon family in the 1940s. It was torn down, and Gary Brinkman built a small house on the property in the 1960s. I have a picture of it from the south as I lived across the street. These 2 blocks from the bank to the lumberyard made a good sledding hill. Corner east, where Leslie Smith now lives, was the home of Ed Pump, who had a shoe repair shop in a building just north of the house. That building still stands. The lumber yard was across the street east and was owned and operated by Moore and then Eggleston and by John Mahoney in the 40s and 50s. Ross McCormick of Unadilla bought it, and Herman Letchemeyer worked for him in the 1960s. In the early 1900s, north and east of the lumber yard was a stockyards run by the Francis family. They shipped on the nearby railroad until trucking started in the 1930s. It is now used by the co-op. The elevator had the first railroad in town in 1922 to get the markets. The co-op added the big elevators for grain storage in the 1950s and added the present building or office. The new post office was built in 1988. Formerly, the post office had 3 locations on the west side of the street in the next block. Longtime postal workers were Mabel Foreman, Helen Morrow Sears, and Barbara Fey. In earliest times, the stagecoach brought the mail to the McKee farm southwest of town. There was a post office in a home in town and in Foster's store. In the old days, businesses extended the length of this 3rd block on both sides of the street. Richard Dick Oakley had the first business in Palmyra in 1869, a general store, continuing in the same building 45 years. Farmers could sell him chickens as well. Les Reckmeyer later had this building and had a thrashing machine business for wheat and oats and also did repair work. There was no saloon in Palmyra for 60 years. Starting in the 1940s, the tavern or beer joint was run by Scotts, Hulls, and Schlechtas and was named the 5th Quarter by Carl Ashmans, who sold it in 1992. Friday night fish fries were popular. Formerly, this big building was Sam Rudge's harness shop. Floyd and Dorothy Palmer had a creamery in connection with Beatrice Creamery and moved their business to Unadilla in the 1940s. Okay. The Bank of Palmyra had its centennial in 1990. It was started by the Catrins of Nebraska City. Castles was the banker in 1910. C.A. Sweet Sr., an attorney and banker from Milford, New York, practiced law in Odo County and was manager and an officer at the bank 66 years, 1883 to 1948, when he was 93. There was formerly another bank in North Palmyra. C.A. Sweet Jr. was the banker until the early 50s. The Sweet family came to Palmyra in 1883. Zelma Taylor Gage and Ruth Sevier Stanley were longtime employees. Maynard Dunlap, formerly of Douglas, bought the bank, and Joe Dowding was manager in the 1970s, and Dave Hall has been the banker since 1980. A house was attached to the south side of the bank and has recently been removed. Crances, Charlotte Robertson, and Doris Luff lived there. Dr. William Cameron lived and had his office here until 1910. Dr. Will Charlton and then Dr. C.P. Percy Charlton was a doctor here until his death in 1942. It is presently the home of Edith Roberts and Jimmy Kohler. Across the street, north from the bank, many buildings were destroyed by fire. The present Cardan building was the Palmyra Auto Company, where my family bought new cars and had them repaired. C.A. Sweet started it in 1912 and owned it until Joe Dowding bought it and operated it 1955 to 67. Teener Hessen and Glenn Cressley, who later moved to Douglas, were mechanics and trained young men of the community. The next building was a drugstore and is now a recently opened cafe owned by the Vern Dowdings. It has been the location of other cafes, Mary's Cafe, her name was Dowding, and Compton's. Next, Spark of the present cafe was the post office for 30 years. In this same area years ago was a variety store, and Walter Barnes had a grocery. Oakley's had a nice clothing store on this block at one time.